They're gonna expedite.
Well, there's something.
Since we got the documents, I'm going to do one quick thing, and then I'm going to do. Good morning. I'm John Fortier. I'm the director of the Democracy Project here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. We are here today on a special occasion to celebrate and talk about Alexander Hamilton. There are a lot of reasons to talk about Hamilton today. We have a great audience. We also have some interesting documents out in the lobby that many of you have seen, and I think some of our audience is still making their way in, looking at the documents. Those documents were provided by Seth Kaller and the Gilder Lehrman Institute, so please take a look at them after the event. But we're here for a couple of reasons. A lot of things going on this week. One, we have a major summit in Singapore tomorrow. Two, since the founding, we've been talking about the imminent war with Canada. That apparently is around the corner. I know. That's a joke. We also, we were a little worried that today would also coincide with the celebration of the Washington Capitals winning the Stanley Cup. Their parade is actually tomorrow, not today, so that's good for us. And but for Alexander Hamilton, that celebration might have been taking place near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, right? So that's not in this neighborhood. And then finally, the Alexander Hamilton, the play, is coming to Washington, D.C. tomorrow. So many of you maybe have seen this, maybe will be seeing this. But we thought an opportunity to talk with a couple of Alexander Hamilton scholars about who is the real Alexander Hamilton. And I'm going to introduce our scholars here and sell some books, maybe. To my left is Steve Knott, who's a professor of political science at the U.S. Naval War College in Rhode Island, and Peter McNamara at Arizona State University. Both are authors of numerous works about the founding, but especially about Alexander Hamilton. So I will just bring a few to the table. Peter McNamara, Political Economy and Statesmanship, Smith, Hamilton, and the Foundation of the Commercial Republic. And Steve Knott, the older book, which is Alexander Hamilton and the Persistence of Myth. We'll talk about the changes in Alexander Hamilton's reputation over time. And more recently, Washington and Hamilton, the alliance that forged America. Now, I will note that we are a couple of days away from Flag Day, a great time to buy books for your relatives, or 4th of July coming up soon, too. So these are all things that will be done. But both of our authors are, again, distinguished scholars in this area, but I think we should pay a debt to somebody, all of us do, and Carol McNamara is here as well, to a couple of people who were our teachers and inspired interest in these things at Boston College. Both Robert Sigliano and Robert Faulkner, I think, had a lot to do with the thoughts that will come out of this panel, as well as some maybe in the room as well. So I'm going to start with a very general question for you. Who is the real Alexander Hamilton, or what's the biggest thing that we should know about Alexander Hamilton? Steve, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Thanks, John. Thanks for having me. I would say one of the biggest myths, and there are lots of myths out there about Hamilton, is this idea that he had nothing but contempt for the average person or for the common man. There's a quote that still circulates that unfortunately should not be circulating, that Hamilton believed the people were a great beast. He did not say that. Or let me put it this way, it's highly unlikely that he ever said that. If you trace the provenance of it, it's very shaky. So this idea that he was sort of our founding plutocrat, the man who founded Wall Street, which to an extent is true, but we can delve deeper into this. He wanted to create an economic system, I think, that would allow people like himself, who arrived here as a relatively penniless immigrant, to be able to rise and to improve their lot in life. So when I hear him described as a plutocrat, as an elitist, as somebody who had contempt for the common man, it does get my back up. And part of the reason it gets my back up is he was also a founding member of the New York Society for the Manumission of Slaves. Now, I would never sit up here and say that Hamilton was an abolitionist. That wasn't, at the forefront of his agenda. But he was anti-slavery. And I think in comparison to For instance, Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the largest slave owners in the state of Virginia, I think Hamilton's record holds up pretty well. So your definition of the common man, I think, has to be extended beyond just white male voters. And if you think of Hamilton's attitude and the Federalist Party's attitude towards free blacks and also Native Americans, the Federalists had a much more, I think, generally speaking, compassionate policy. That's what gets my back up, this notion that he was somehow hateful of the common man. If you include African Americans and Native Americans in that group, it's just fiction.
I did not know in my introductions that Steve used to teach at the University of Virginia. Apparently might not be as welcome there today.
I worked there under an assumed name.
Yeah. Yes. Pacificus or no? Peter, you're either big myths or just the biggest points about Hamilton that you want to put on the table.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me. Thanks for coming. I'd say the most important thing to know about Hamilton would be that he was the guy who thought through the foundations of the modern nation state. There'd been modern nation states prior to the United States, the Dutch Republic, Great Britain, but they kind of happened accidentally. Hamilton found himself in a situation where he had to really think through all the connections between taxes and finance and military power, government, constitutionalism. And as one commentator from Hamilton's time said, Hamilton did the thinking for his day. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And what's interesting is a lot of what he had to say is still relevant. And as long as the modern nation state still exists, I think will continue to be relevant. I'd add one thing to that description of Hamilton's contribution, and that would be that it was not just a kind of technical thing he was trying to think through, numbers, military power, and so on. He was thinking through how you build a civilized society, one where individuals can flourish. This goes along with Steve's point, I think, and not just where individuals can find themselves, utilize their talents, and thrive.
So I'm not going to go through it historically, but I do want to start a little bit with pre-founding. And Steve, you of course have this book on Washington and Hamilton. We don't have to talk about the earliest days, but at least tell us about Hamilton before the founding, how he came to know Washington, what the important points were. What do you want to highlight there?
I think the thing I would highlight most is that of all the key founders, Alexander Hamilton came from the most dysfunctional background. His father ran off on the family when he was, part of the reason I'm hesitating on his age was because we're not sure when he was born. It was either 1755 or 1757. But it was a highly dysfunctional family. He was born on the island of Nevis in the Caribbean. His father takes off when he's 8 or 10 years old. And then his mother dies, I think, 2 years after his father abandons the family. And so he's passed from one family member to another, again, in highly dysfunctional circumstances. But he was a remarkable intellect. He loved to read. He had access to a library at a Jewish school in the island of St. Croix. So he was constantly combing through all of the books in that school. And then he becomes the head of a sort of export-import firm in St. Croix at the age of either 12 or 14. He's running this place and dealing with these salty, caustic sea captains from all over the world. So he's learning about international trade. He's learning how to deal with some pretty rough characters as a boy. And I think some of the experiences in that import-export firm will hold him in good stead later when he becomes Treasury Secretary. But it's a very highly dysfunctional upbringing. Fortunately, his biggest break is when some of the wealthy merchants on St. Croix raised some money to send him to the States for an education. And so I believe we're talking 1773 here, more or less. He comes to the United States, arrives in Boston, but quickly makes his way to New York City, tries to get into Princeton University on an expedited program of study. John Witherspoon, the president, says no. He ends up at what is now Columbia University, what was then King's College. And when he's in New York City, this, of course, is the period when revolutionary fervor is really taking hold. He raises an artillery company as a young 19 or 21-year-old captain, and that's how he comes to the attention of General George Washington during the Battle of Long Island in August of 1776. We're not quite sure if Washington saw Hamilton personally in action or was told by either Henry Knox, who was Washington's artillery chief, or there's another rumor or theory that it was General Nathaniel Greene. But somehow or another, Hamilton comes to Washington's attention, and Washington asks him to join his staff, and he becomes a staff officer in February 1777. And I would argue, just to finish, he is the most important member of Washington's staff in terms of an ability to work seemingly 24/7, an ability to quickly understand Washington's thinking, to the point where Washington actually entrusts Hamilton with some of the secrets of that Culper spy ring that operates in and around New York City. Some of you watch the AMC series Turn. You're familiar with this. Hamilton's one of the few staff officers who actually had access to that. That's how much Washington trusted him.
And just to promote yet another book, you have a book on espionage in the early republic, which covers some of this as well. So, Peter, there's a lot to say about the founding and Hamilton's role in this, but please give us the highlights. Then we'll delve into some of the specifics about federalism, a strong executive. But tell us his role and what's most important about his role in the founding and thinking about our nation. You talked generally before, but what's most important?
Sure. It's in the period, after the Revolution that this question of who's the real Alexander Hamilton starts to emerge, and it becomes kind of acute when he's part of Washington's administration. He becomes the first Secretary of the Treasury. John Marshall commented and was probably the first person to analyze in his Life of Washington, which comes out 1804, 1805, and this phenomenon. And Hamilton took office I'll mention a couple of things that Marshall mentioned. Took office at a particularly difficult and tempestuous time, and where passions were running high, where there were extremely difficult and complex problems to be solved, and some unpopular things that needed to be done, like raising taxes. That's never popular. It's an issue that's easily demagogued, and was at the time. And so you have Marshall notes, you have two sort of views of Hamilton that emerge, and the product of this particularly complicated time, particularly passionate time. One of Hamilton who is working diligently to secure the American Republican experiment, and then another Hamilton who's working diligently to subvert that American Republican experiment. So two totally contradictory impressions of what Hamilton was doing. Marshall sort of suggests that the Democratic Republicans, Hamilton's opponents, were perhaps sincere in their criticisms of him, or many of them were. But it's at that time you get the division, the first division that occurs over what Hamilton was actually up to. just to what Marshall said, I'd add a couple of things. One is that Hamilton was dealing with really novel problems. How to build a large republic. That was thought to be, go back to Montesquieu, impossible. But that was the problem he'd been set. And it's easy to see how there could be misunderstandings, honest disagreements, disagreements about people's motives and intentions. Last thing I'd sort of mention is that as to this question of why the issue of the real Alexander Hamilton comes up, is that Hamilton acted, and Steve might like to say something about this, as a kind of lightning rod. It'd be hard to sort of prove this 100%, but Hamilton acted as a kind of lightning rod to Washington. Washington, it was taboo to criticize Washington, at least in his first term of office. But so then who do you criticize? Alexander Hamilton. And one could, if one was a little cynical, one could see, to some degree, Washington at work in this creation of this question of who's the real Hamilton. Yeah.
So that's helpful. I almost want to take Steve on the road forward about his reputation, but I want to wait on that a bit. Just can we go back a little bit to even the pre-Washington days, or to the founding, to the Constitutional Convention, and Hamilton's views here, and maybe I'll put it to you, Steve. Peter mentioned some of the elements, and many of the founders who later disagreed or on other sides of issues had similar views, but I think even then there were some questions. I'll put it this way: Hamilton, a modernizer or a monarchist? There are elements of that which come through in the debates, the Constitutional Convention, in the Federalist Papers. Tell us some of the elements of Hamilton's thinking about what this new venture was going to look like, and why he, on some issues, might have had a different view than some of the other founders.
Yeah. So Hamilton, the monarchist, it stems in good part from his speech he delivered at the Constitutional Convention in the middle of June 1787. Let me qualify this by saying Hamilton wasn't a particularly active delegate at the Constitutional Convention. The governor of New York, who was an anti-federalist, made sure that he surrounded Hamilton with fellow anti-federalists. So Hamilton was, in a sense, outvoted, outgunned within the New York delegation. But his most noticeable utterances were delivered, I think it was June 18th, 1787. And he delivered a 3, 4, 5, 6 lengthy speech, as he had a tendency to run on, both in his oral and written communications. But in that address, he called for a president elected for life. And that's going to be one of the primary sources for this accusation that Hamilton was a monarchist. He also suggested a Senate elected for life, both on the basis of good behavior. The president would still be subject to impeachment, and of course would be elected. But that would mean we'd be in year 40-something of the Jimmy Carter presidency today. But I think that's where it began. Now, Jefferson, of course, is not at the Constitutional Convention, but his good friend James Madison, of course, is arguably the key figure at the convention. He's taking copious notes of all the comments that are being made. And we know at some point that Madison, after the fact, shows Jefferson his notes from the Constitutional Convention. And when Jefferson, I think, comes across these passages about a president being elected for life, and then you couple it with some of the steps that we'll talk about later when he becomes Treasury Secretary, this perception that he's not only a monarchist, but in Jeffersonian circles, they come to believe he might even be a British agent, on the payroll of the British Secret Service. So I would say that June speech in which he argues for a president and Senate elected for life is where the seed gets planted. Now, it's also true, and this is ignored, unfortunately, his proposal for a House of Representatives was actually more democratic than the one that ultimately comes to pass. So his proposal for a so-called high-toned federal government it had a mix of elements to it, including a much more democratic House of Representatives. So I would, in my view, this notion of Hamilton as a monarchist is part of the mythology. As far as modernism, I'll leave most of this to Peter, but I think that his later economic proposals indicate that he was far ahead of his time, certainly far ahead of his great Virginia rivals, who some have referred to as slavocrats. Hamilton's economy was going to be arguably much more of an opportunity society, if you will, than the one that the Virginians were sort of sitting atop on their plantations. So in that sense, I think he was very much the modernist.
And thank you, former UVA professor Steve Knott. Peter, we definitely want to get into the economic thought, but if I could hold out a bit, just do you want to say more about the modernism in other respects at his thinking of the founding and what our country would look like?
Right. Let me just say something about the monarchism issue, and then I'll turn to modernism. It was Hamilton's thinking about forms of government departed, I think, from many of his contemporaries in this respect, and he says this explicitly, that he's at heart a real Montesquieuian. That different forms of government, you have to adjust forms of government to circumstances. So some places you really do need a monarchy. When he comes to make suggestions about what should happen in Haiti's post-revolutionary situation, you basically need a military dictator. In the United States, he thought that a republic was possible. A large republic was possible. It was not a certainty, though. As Harvey Flommenhoft at St. John's College just up the road argued, for Hamilton, the American experiment was really an experiment. And my reading of what he did was that he was really genuinely trying to secure that experiment. But more so than for someone like Jefferson, I think it was really an experiment. It might not work. It hadn't worked before. So I'd add that to Steve's comments. On the modernization issue, yeah, it's really true. Hamilton saw himself as trying to put into place the constituent parts of a modern nation state. And as I mentioned previously, this had happened in the Dutch Republic, in Great Britain, but Hamilton was thinking this through in American circumstances. How do you do this when you've got a Republican system of government? You've got a gigantic country. And that was a real problem for Hamilton, how to hold a country this size together. So I'd leave it at that.
Okay, let's we'll take two topics up. They're related, but the framers and Hamilton's view of political parties. The founders were not enamored of them, and yet they emerged quite quickly. And of course, Hamilton and Madison, Jefferson on the opposite sides of these. So maybe say something about the theory and the practice. So why were they worried about political parties? And say something about the origin of how we got them quickly and what Hamilton began to think about them.
Yeah. Well, I think everyone says this, that they didn't anticipate parties. They thought that disinterested representatives would debate, deliberate, but parties form very quickly. It turns out that both Hamilton, but certainly Jefferson and Madison, who seem to have thought through the problem of parties much better, turn out to be very good at being partisans. It's one of those quirks of the founding. They railed against parties. This was an opportunity for hypocrisy and demagoguery too. You can rail against parties and act as a savage partisan. Jefferson occasionally lamented that. Hamilton occasionally lamented that. but they took to it like fish to water, I'd say. And that's been with us ever since. Now, why is that? To some degree, it goes back to what I was saying before about those comments of John Marshall. People need ways to simplify complex problems and to communicate with the wider society. And that's one of the roles that parties have played as a kind of way of mobilizing public opinion, thinking through maybe not very deeply sometimes complex issues, but something like parties do seem to be necessary in a large republic, and that seems to be an accidental discovery of the founding generation.
And Steve, do you want to say something?
Sure.
Because again, I think maybe Peter's right that as the Jeffersonians began more as an opposition party and maybe thought it out a little more, but of course Hamilton becomes essentially the leader of the Federalist Party, even within the Washington administration. So thinking about it in the Constitutional Convention, and then what happens and what Hamilton thought about parties emerging.
Yeah, well, I'm going to jump right to the presidency of George Washington, because of course this is when the first party system is born. It's really Jefferson, and let me qualify what I'm about to say. I've made this confession in front of other public groups as well. I admit that I suffer from Jefferson derangement syndrome, so take this with a massive grain of, well, not a massive grain of salt, but a grain of salt. Jefferson is Washington's Secretary of State. Hamilton is Secretary of the Treasury. Jefferson begins to lose almost every major cabinet battle during that first term of President Washington. And out of a sense of frustration, he begins to organize the opposition while serving within President Washington's administration. He actually puts a guy by the name of Philip Freneau on the State Department payroll in the position of a translator. And all the guy does is write anti-administration editorials while being paid by the American taxpayer. All of this is done, well, I was going to say somewhat surreptitiously. Hamilton catches on to this, I think, fairly quickly. And Hamilton and Knox and some of the others try to warn President Washington that Jefferson is undermining him covertly. Washington refuses to accept these warnings, and it may say something about Washington's character that he's unable to sort of recognize that kind of duplicity, particularly in a fellow Virginian of whom you would think he would share the same worldview. But the party of Thomas Jefferson, the Democrat Republicans, which ultimately segues into the Democratic Party, is really the first American political party. Hamilton and the Federalists are constantly playing catch-up. They're constantly on the defense. And even though I said I suffer from Jefferson derangement syndrome, I also have to confess that Thomas Jefferson, as a political leader, as a party leader, was way ahead of Alexander Hamilton on that front. Jefferson had, I think, the kind of characteristics that one looks for in an effective party leader. Jefferson was adept at using surrogates to do his dirtier business for him. Hamilton was much more in your face. So if he disagreed with you on the National Bank or whatever, he'd let you know. But it would be face to face. He thought that was the manly or honorable thing to do. Jefferson was far more comfortable using surreptitious means to convey his messages, including, creating an opposition press. So by 1802, I apologize for jumping way ahead, but in 1802, Hamilton confesses to some of his fellow Federalists that we're getting our clocks cleaned. We cannot, and I'm obviously loosely paraphrasing here, we cannot compete with the Jeffersonians at the sort of street level. And this is when Hamilton proposes a Christian constitutional society. They're going to try to use the the Congregationalist churches, particularly in the Northeast, as a kind of political base to counter the power of the Jeffersonian political movement. But it's too late. And by 1816, the Federalists run their last presidential candidate. Jefferson succeeds in destroying the Federalist Party. He put it Jefferson said in a letter in 1802 that he was going to sink the Federalists into an abyss from which they shall never return. And he succeeded.
Let me turn, long promise, we turn to economic policy. And, there's a lot said in today's discourse about free trade, let's say, mercantilism. But there's a broader set of issues here. Hamilton was clearly a promoter of a commercial republic, but saw the role for government and statesmanship in certain ways. Tell us how you think, give us the big picture of Hamilton's economic policy, but also distinguish it, as you do in your book, from Adam Smith or people who might see the market as more freely operating without some necessary role of government or role of statesmanship.
Sure. Hamilton, he was criticized for doing this, and this fed into the conspiracy theories about him, wanted to introduce into the United States the basic features of a modern nation. One of the most controversial things he suggested was a national bank. In the United States at the time, when he suggested this, 1791, there were 3 banks. And Hamilton was proposing a bank several times the size of the 3 of those put together. This would be it would be a private bank, but it would do the nation's business. It could lend money to the federal government. The federal government could deposit money in it if it had a surplus. This was a kind of basic feature of any modern nation. Now, banks to many Americans at the time were a little bit like credit default swaps and shorting the VIX, things that ordinary people have no clue. So you could see how those kind of proposals could have been misinterpreted, and especially because they seem to derive from British precedents. Now, more broadly, Hamilton wanted to introduce the other features of what he saw, and this is where he is a bit of a visionary and goes beyond people like Adam Smith. Introduce not just a modern financial system, but a modern industrial system as well. Now, this will get to some of the more controversial issues of the present day, or today actually. Hamilton was not down the line free trader when it came to economic policy. He believed that nations needed to take steps, and they were perfectly justified to take steps to promote their own industries for 2 reasons. One, if you need a modern nation state needs a powerful military. It needs, to go along with that, a military-industrial complex, as someone called it later on. That's just a fact of life. You can't avoid it. But more than that, and Adam Smith was allowed to make that exception, made that exception as well. But more broadly, in terms of government support for domestic industries, Hamilton was for it. He wasn't for high protective tariffs. Tariffs, very blunt instrument, help efficient domestic industries and inefficient domestic industries at the same time, annoy other nations. Hamilton, basically throughout his term as Treasury Secretary, fought against attempts by Jefferson and Madison to prosecute a trade war with Great Britain. They were confident the United States could defeat Great Britain in such a war, a trade war. Hamilton thought that was crazy. He also had another reason why he was against high protective tariffs and trade wars that they might lead to, and that is that his whole financial system depended on revenues derived from import duties. And if import duties were disrupted for whatever reason. Basically, the nation's main revenue source would dry up. His new financial system would collapse. So for a number of reasons, you couldn't describe him as a protectionist of the kind that you'd find after the Civil War in the United States, and maybe even before the Civil War as well. So I mentioned those couple of things as preliminaries. So there was a financial side and an industrial side. And one last point. On the industrial side, Hamilton saw much more clearly than I think Adam Smith did the importance of technology and the importance and the need to promote technological advances, even to the point of engaging in a little industrial espionage against the British. So.
We're saying.
Yeah, just to add to what Peter said, in addition to Hamilton's economic proposals and the creation of the National Bank and the assumption of the state debts, all of the debts from the Revolutionary War, having the federal government essentially take that on and pay it down and establish a good credit rating in the international markets. But in addition to those economic steps, I think everything that Hamilton and George Washington were about during those critical first 8 years of the early republic was to try to convince their fellow Americans, as Hamilton put it, to think continentally, to get them to think beyond think of themselves no longer as Virginians or New Yorkers, but as Americans. And so in addition to these very important policy steps, you have sort of symbolic gestures like the issuance of a Thanksgiving proclamation in 1789, which is addressed to the people of the United States of America. In a sense, Washington preempted the state governors who had a tradition of issuing those kinds of proclamations and directs this directly at the people and asks them, in a sense, to give thanks for this new government and to pray for its continued success. And then also even another symbolic gesture like Washington's tour of the New England states, I think in 1790, and then the southern states later on, covering thousands of miles on these horrible dirt roads. But the point was to convince Americans to think continentally, to let them see their new president, to persuade them indirectly, but clearly that they were now Americans. They were no longer Georgians or, citizens of Connecticut.
So I promised you that I would have you take us on the longer tour of Hamilton's reputation. But first I'm going to show you my favorite portrait of Alexander Hamilton. It's right here. And I know how much of a lover of Hamilton you are, so I would be willing to trade you this for your portrait of Andrew Jackson in your wallet. In fact, I will make that offer to the audience as a whole. But I will note that, not that long ago, less than 10 years ago, we were thinking of taking Mr. Hamilton off of the $10 bill. And it is, I think, realistically due to the play in New York, the book, Ron Chertow's book, and the play in New York where some of his later fellow New Yorkers and others really came to love Hamilton again. And that had not been the case 10 or 15 years ago. And there have been many, many ups and downs. So we got the beginning of the story. Some of it has to do with the economic policy differences, the origins of the party, the personality differences. But tell us the long and interesting story of his ups and downs through our history.
Well, so I mentioned earlier that Jefferson was determined to sink the Federalists into an abyss from which they shall never emerge, and he succeeded at that. The Federalists are pretty well dead by, if not 1816, 1820 at the latest. And so what happens is that I've always said that Hamilton is the first victim of the politics of personal destruction. So it wasn't enough to counter the arguments of the Federalists on the bank or on industrialization or whatever. Hamilton had to be destroyed. He was the leader. He was the Colossus, as Jefferson referred to him. And so in 1797, one of Jefferson's newspaper proteges, James Callender, who was on Jefferson's payroll for a time, publishes the account of Hamilton's extramarital affair with Maria Reynolds, which had occurred 5 years early. Hamilton confesses to it in a 90-plus page, lurid account of the various details of the affair. He could never, contain himself on a number of fronts. This is step one of many to not just, as I said, not just rebuff the Federalists on policy grounds, but to destroy their leader. And of course, you couple the fact that he's now portrayed as not just an adulterer, but a serial adulterer by the Jeffersonians. You couple that with this alleged monarchism, that's a killer. Calling somebody a monarchist in the 1790s and early 1800s is equivalent to calling somebody a communist in the 1950s. It's designed to destroy you. It's designed to remove you from the public square. And that was the campaign that was conducted by Jefferson and by his successors in the Democratic Party. Andrew Jackson, for instance, in his war with the Bank of the United States, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's the ghost of Hamilton that lurks in the background. Jackson is the champion of the common man. Jackson's going to take on this elitist, Philadelphia-based institution that favors the coastal plutocrats. But it's always the battle between Jefferson, the champion of the common man, and Hamilton, the champion of the elites, is very much alive long after those gentlemen are dead. It's kept alive by Andrew Jackson. It's kept alive by Martin Van Buren. There's a brief period in American history, and that would be during the Civil War and after the Civil War, where Hamilton is sort of resurrected. The party of Jefferson is in eclipse because of the Civil War, because of the issue of slavery. There you have a number of Republican presidents during the Gilded Age, Benjamin Harrison, James Garfield, and some others who revere Hamilton. Even Teddy Roosevelt reveres Hamilton. But that 40 or 50-year period ends pretty decisively with the election of Woodrow Wilson, who really sees Hamilton very much as in that sort of elitist, plutocrat, champion of Wall Street terms. And then it's Franklin Roosevelt that really it's Franklin Roosevelt who elevates Thomas Jefferson into the pantheon, into the Holy Trinity, this beautiful monument over here on the tidal basin, which I love, by the way. It's very, very well done. That's erected by Franklin Roosevelt. In fact, Roosevelt supposedly plays a hand in selecting the truncated quotes that adorn the walls of the Jefferson Memorial. But as a consequence, Hamilton is really eclipsed during the FDR years. And FDR makes a point of comparing himself, FDR, with Jefferson. He's the new Jefferson. And Herbert Hoover and the Republicans are the Hamiltonians, the champions of Wall Street, the champions of the elites, the people who want to tuck it to the common man. And that may sound like an exaggeration, but it's not. There is a kind of concerted campaign during the New Deal years to elevate Jefferson and to denigrate Hamilton, to the point where, as I say in one of my books, when World War II arrives, Jefferson is everywhere. Hamilton is occasionally mentioned, but usually with a comment like this, and this is almost a direct quote from a journal from 1943. Well, if Hamilton were alive today, he'd probably oppose the Nazis. He was really seen as our sort of closet Napoleon. And that image holds, particularly in progressive political and scholarly circles, until the 1960s. And then it starts to break a little bit, because all of a sudden race becomes a matter of concern, not only in the political arena, but also in the academic arena. And people begin to look at the contrasting records of one of the largest slave owners in the state of Virginia versus one of the founders of the New York Society for the Manumission of Slaves, who it appears never owned slaves. Now again, I want to make it clear, Hamilton's not Frederick Douglass. He's not an abolitionist, but he is anti-slavery. And he has a much more progressive attitude on slavery and on the Haitian independence movement that Peter referred to earlier. And that's where you begin to see a kind of rethinking take place. Now, it's gradual. And then the revelations of the Sally Hemings affair and the not revelations, the DNA testing that would appear to perhaps support the idea of a relationship between Jefferson and one of his slaves. That kind of figures into it. And the final thing I'll add is Hamilton's status as an immigrant. So that by the 1990s and the 2000s, immigration is becoming an issue. Of all the key founders, Hamilton is the sole immigrant in the group. And I think that also contributes to a kind of reconsideration of just who really was the champion of the common man, who more accurately reflected the average man's and woman's experiences. So I would say race and immigration in the last 50 years have allowed Hamilton to sort of regain what I consider to be his rightful place.
And Steve has many examples in the book, but one I know we've talked about before is if you go over to the National Archives built during the FDR presidency, beautiful murals recently restored, and you see some pretty majestic looking Jefferson and Madison and a kind of creepy conspiratorial looking Hamilton lurking in the background. So go check it out this afternoon. Peter, yes, on this.
Yeah, just add one thing to Steve's account, which I think is very, very telling and explains a lot about the ups and downs of Hamilton's reputation. Actually, let me add two things. One, if you want to see one of the products of the period of where Hamilton was riding high after the Civil War, late 19th century, there's a novel, it's a piece of historical fiction, Gertrude Atherton's novel, The Conqueror. And it's a real potboiler. And she just makes up a lot of stuff, especially about Hamilton's early life. But it sold very well. The thing I was going to point to with respect to Hamilton and why there's been these ups and downs of his reputation is that, and I've always found this a bit of a puzzle or something strange about Hamilton, that he never sat down and wrote a kind of magnum opus. There's the Federalist Papers, of course, but he never sat down and laid out what he thought. And he apparently sometimes spoke as though he did, but he never did. When he left the Treasury Department, he sat down and wrote 25 or 30,000 words defending his stint as Treasury Secretary, but then he stopped. He never, and I've always found that a bit of a puzzle. Now maybe had he lived longer, but he wasn't able to set down that marker that you could have judged what Jefferson and company said about him against what he really believed.
Just to add a small point, so of course he's killed in the duel with Aaron Burr in July 1804. Jefferson lives for another 22 years. John Adams lives for another 22 years. Believe me, they use that time to sort of spin the historical record. So Hamilton, and Eliza Hamilton realizes this. She's desperately trying during this period to find somebody who will write a biography of her husband's life. She ends up having to get her son, John C. Hamilton, to do it. It's not that great. But Jefferson, Adams, even I would say James Madison to an extent, he lives another 32 years. So they use that time to help shape, to help spin the public record and to make sure that Hamilton is given his due. I mean, Adams despised Hamilton. And if you want a good laugh sometimes, just sort of Google John Adams on Alexander Hamilton, where he talks about Hamilton at one point delivering a speech under the influence of opium. Talks about Hamilton's superabundance of secretions that leads him into unbridled whoring. For whatever reason, Abigail Adams and John Adams were just obsessed with Hamilton's sex life.
Abigail talked about his Hamilton's lascivious eyes.
Yeah.
So let me come back to a couple of big themes. We've touched on them before. Federalism. You mentioned the Thanksgiving address. Hamilton worried about, wanted to have a nation, worried about it splitting apart. What are his thoughts on federalism?
He feared the power of the states, and especially the big states. And I think in Hamilton's, he comes close to saying that in that June 18 speech at the convention that maybe the states should be dissolved. But even then, he adds, there have to be subordinate authorities in this, in a country so big. So I think in his ideal world, there still would be states. They might be under tighter controls of the federal government, and they would have been smaller. That, I think, was his ideal world. Now, at times, it's important to remember when we're trying to figure out how mainstream or otherwise Hamilton was, at the convention afterwards, James Madison was also for really keeping the states under on a short leash, and especially with respect to individual rights and liberties, making sure that they weren't abused by the states.
Yeah. Foreign policy. We have time is here more talk about realist foreign policy. There's a certain way in which Hamilton was to be described by that. How would you describe Hamilton's thoughts on foreign policy? And he certainly thought about this both in writings, and he was involved in it as an actor as well.
Go ahead.
I mean, one of the key events, of course, during President Washington's administration is the revolution in France, and to the extent to which the United States should not necessarily intervene in that event, but whether it should tilt in a way towards the French or perhaps towards the British, who are kind of leading the counter-revolutionary forces in Europe. This becomes a major policy dispute, one of many, and it's on par with the bank, it's on par with the Assumption Plan. And I think, Hamilton, rightly so, is often described as the father of American realism, the father of realism in American foreign policy. He's very critical of Jefferson and some of Jefferson's supporters who are urging this sort of tilt towards France. Again, I don't want to make it seem that Jefferson wanted to intervene on behalf of the French. He wasn't willing to go that far, but he certainly wanted the United States to, as much as it realistically could, assist our fellow revolutionary brethren in France. When the revolution in France turns into a bloodletting, and it turns into a bloodletting fairly quickly, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington all sort of sensed it coming, and were trying to caution both American diplomats in France and also their French contacts to try to avoid that kind of excess. The interesting thing is that Jefferson, as our Secretary of State, you don't see that. There's a comfort level with the bloodletting that is occurring in France, to the point where some of you are probably familiar with this. Jefferson writes his famous so-called Adam and Eve letter, where he says, if the French Revolution, if the cost of that revolution to succeed is that every man and woman save one in order to keep the species alive is killed, so be it. This is the price you have to pay to overthrow the old order. That kind of abstract thinking appalled Hamilton. And he would later, though I may be off on the timing here, it could have been earlier, but I think later, accuse Jefferson and Madison and some of the others of having, and this is him, not me, having a womanish attachment to France. In other words, they're letting their passions dictate American foreign policy. They're letting that gratitude that we felt towards the French for helping us in our revolution dictate our foreign policy when our national interest demanded that we stay the heck out of it and perhaps, if anything, tilt towards our largest trading partner, the British. So Hamilton is very much about national interest. I think there's much more of an idealistic streak in Jefferson. Hamilton's attitude towards this notion that we somehow owed the French was a little bit legalistic. He makes the case, hey, that arrangement we had was with Louis the 16th. He's dead. He's been decapitated. That treaty is void. This new government, we did not sign a treaty of cooperation with this revolutionary government. And Jefferson was appalled by that kind of legalistic cold-hearted approach to the French Revolution.
Just one small point on the French Revolution, and then I'll just say something about Hamilton's foreign policy. With respect to the Revolution, Hamilton was convinced pretty early that it was going to go bad. But one of the reasons he was convinced early was that they were trying to do something that was, given French circumstances, impossible, to create a republic. The best he thought they could do was a constitutional monarchy, maybe along British lines, but the project of making France a republic was just visionary in his mind. In terms of broader foreign policy, I'd agree with Steve that there's a kind of realism about Hamilton. That's what we would call it today. But it was a realism that was couched in the language of the day in terms of the law of nations. That nations pursue their interests, but they do so with certain rights and responsibilities, and there's a benefit from what we would call today a system of rules or a system of international norms. Now, when people step outside those norms, that's where the realism, the strong realism kicks in. But Hamilton did see benefits from international trade, abiding by certain international norms. He was not a Machiavellian, which is sometimes is ascribed to him.
So you gave a great history about Hamilton's reputation, but you didn't really mention the play. You kind of got, or you said there's a precursor to the play. You got up to. So one, if you say a little bit about the importance of the play and resurrecting his reputation.
Oh,
but
yeah, sorry.
And then secondly, maybe both of you, and you've seen the play, and I want to give it away to everybody here who might be going in the next month or so. But what does the play really get right, and what should it have addressed more? What's missing?
Yeah, so Ron Chernow's book, Hamilton, his biography on Hamilton, comes out in 2004. A young, I'm sure you guys, most of you know this story, a young Lin-Manuel Miranda takes that book on a trip to Mexico, I think, and falls in love with the book and with Hamilton. And so what I'm about to say in terms of some praise and criticism for the musical, it all goes back to Ron Chernow, who, by the way, I mean, you know, somebody who admires Hamilton, you know, God bless him for what he did. He, you know, I think put Hamilton back on the map, and I should have mentioned that earlier. But I do think the musical tries to portray Hamilton as more of an abolitionist than he was, and it's more of an, it doesn't explicitly say this, but it's kind of a plea for immigrants and open borders, perhaps, and Hamilton's position on immigration was more complex than that. When he writes his report on manufacturing, which I think Peter mentioned earlier, he does talk about the need perhaps to allow more immigrants into the United States as a pool of labor to help get this industrialized America off the ground. So that's in 1791 or 2. But by 1800, when Jefferson is on the horizon, Hamilton has kind of shifted his position on immigration, and he sees proposals on the part of the Jeffersonians to liberalize immigration laws as an attempt to increase the voter rolls for the Democrat, Republican, or Jeffersonian Party. So he's yes, his story as an immigrant and his rags to riches tale is extremely impressive, but his position, his policy positions on immigration, I think, are perhaps lost in the musical. And then, as I've said before, there is at least the implication, perhaps, and it's, you know, you have a very biracial cast that in the musical, that Hamilton was more of an activist on the issue of slavery than he actually was. I think we can safely say that for Hamilton, it was Union first, and in this sense, he kind of resembles Abraham Lincoln. You know, secure the Union first, and then put slavery on the path to extinction. And partly, I think, his economic proposals would have done, or did do, exactly that, a free market is not conducive to slavery, in my view, and I think in his view. So I think it's a terrific musical. I have to say, I went in there thinking, how can a hip-hop musical on the nation's first Treasury Secretary actually work? Which is why I guess I'm in academia and not on Broadway. I should have. But it does work. God bless Chernow and Miranda for keeping Hamilton on the $10 bill. It does. I don't think it happens otherwise, as John mentioned earlier. But it's got a perspective, and the perspective is one of sort of contemporary progressive politics.
You're not going to be writing Gallatin the musical, or is that? I mean, that's for you, Peter. No. Peter.
Yeah. So, what does it get right? What does it get wrong? A couple of points on each. What does it get right? One thing that gets right, and Steve has written a book about this, is the relationship between Hamilton and Washington. That Hamilton really was Washington's right-hand man, and that was a deep puzzle to people like Adams and Jefferson. Like, this guy who comes out of nowhere is suddenly got the ear of the George Washington, the most famous man in the world for a couple of decades. And the play gets that right. It gets right that the Revolution, the period of the founding, was an exciting time. It wasn't just stiff guys, seriously deliberating. There was a lot going on. There was love, action, passion. I think it gets that right. I'm a bit more sympathetic to the idea that it gets the immigrant story right. There's, the great punchline in the musical is Lafayette and Hamilton's saying, "Immigrants, we get the job done." Lafayette, of course, wasn't an immigrant. This is where they fiddles a bit with history, but Lafayette wasn't, of course, an immigrant. He was just here for the fight. But you could have put in Albert Gallatin, who was Jefferson and Madison's Secretary of the Treasury, Swiss, and I guess with respect to Hamilton and Gallatin, this is one of the first instances, I guess, of jobs Americans won't do. The Secretary of the Treasury, you're going to import a foreign. What does it get wrong? It fiddles, as I mentioned, a lot with the details of history. In any work of art, this is necessary, but it slights Jefferson and Madison. Madison is just a bit. Jefferson is kind of the villain in the story. Burr, of course, as well, but Madison is just a bit player. The father of the Constitution, father of the Bill of Rights. So that gets that wrong. Other things as well, but maybe the one that struck me most, and this is a problematic side of Hamilton. The musical makes Hamilton, in a way, the embodiment of the American dream. Immigrant, trying to make a name for himself, succeeds on his own devices. I think that understates the character of Hamilton's ambition. Hamilton's ambition, his desire for fame, was extreme. A pal of his, Fisher Ames, has this eulogy where he says that Hamilton wanted the wreath of immortality, and that really burned in him. And that's touched on in the musical, but I don't think enough. And that passion led Hamilton to do some not so smart things. It led him to talk sometimes as though his country was failing him, not that it wasn't living up to his expectations. That's a problematic side of Hamilton, and that gets lost sight of in the musical.
Yeah, just a couple of things. George Washington spoke about Hamilton's ambition and described it in very positive terms. In other words, it wasn't a dangerous ambition. This is not Aaron Burr that we're talking about here. I'm not suggesting Peter was saying that. So it was a noble kind of ambition, at least in the view of George Washington, who, in my view, had a pretty good estimate of people's characters. Second point, I should have mentioned this in response to John's questions, and I hate to keep harping on the mistakes of the musical because I did enjoy it very much. I'm going to see it for a third time this fall. I no longer have any money, but I'm enjoying it. There are two references in the musical, and Miranda got this from Chernow. So again, this is Chernow's mistake, although Chernow's not alone on this. There are two references, and in fact, I believe it's one of the few times in the musical where the Hamilton character actually stops and kind of breaks out of character, looks at the crowd and says, "That's true." And the "that's true" is in response to a line that Hamilton was such a adulterer that Martha Washington named her Randy Tomcat Hamilton. That's in there twice in the musical, and again, at one point, it's given an exclamation point where the Hamilton character says, "That's true." It's not true. It's total fiction. But Chernow reported it as fact, and he's not alone. I mean, I even had a email exchange with Gordon Wood, who's a professor of history at Brown University and, one of the best. Wood had been circulating that story as well. It turns out that the source for that story was, it first appeared sometime in the 1780s in a British newspaper under probably a pseudonym by a so-called Captain Smith, who said that not only did Martha Washington name her horny tomcat Hamilton, but that George Washington had 13 toes, one for each state. And it was filled with things like that. That's the source. And it's an interesting little, I grant you it's a small thing, but it's an interesting little case study in how historical narratives get handed down over centuries based on fiction. And that if you trace things back to the source, you realize that this story, and just go ahead and Google it, you'll find very, very prominent authors are still circulating this story about Martha Washington. Now, I'm not an expert on Martha Washington, but does that sound like something Martha Washington would do? Name her horny tomcat after her husband's closest advisor? I don't think so. And then if you go back and look at the source, it does turn out to be fiction.
All right, we're going to turn to your questions. I'm going to ask one question while we get the mics going. When the mics do come around, I want you to ask a question and identify yourself, or in the other order. But while we're doing that, one last quick question. We've got to be quick on the answer to this, but just what is your... Hamilton died prematurely. What were his thoughts about the future of America at the time? What was it? What, was he worried about it? What was he thinking about how the American project was going?
It was a question still. With the Louisiana Purchase, Hamilton had qualms about that. He recognized it to be a necessity, but gnawing at him always was this question of how big the country was and how it would hang together.
Yeah, one of his last letters, I believe, he refers to the Constitution as a frail and worthless fabric that he has devoted his life to trying to prop up, which was true. But he believed in during Jefferson's America that Constitution was being eroding rapidly, and that was not a healthy thing. So he was somewhat pessimistic towards the end.
Great. Okay, we're going to turn to your questions. Why don't we come right here? Right. Come either way.
Hi, good morning. Stacy Bridges. Two questions, one comment. You said that FDR promoted Thomas Jefferson and molded him to this iconic figure that we had today. You don't think any of his writings, his inventions, had anything to do with where he is at and why he is so loved today. And that brings me to my actual question is, was Alexander Hamilton actually pro-Native, pro-Black? Because we actually needed slavery to build this country because it was a young country. We needed the cheap labor. Was his rhetoric, was this rhetoric or was it realism? Because Thomas Jefferson did, his slaves that he did have were wedding gifts from his family. What else did Jefferson do? I wrote my question down, I'm sorry. Oh, okay. I just blanked out. He also, he wanted slavery added in the Declaration of Independence, and that was stricken out. And he also was regretful the way Americans had treated Native Americans, and he said God's wrath would come upon them. So I feel like Jefferson's maybe being vilified, and you're trying to lift up Alexander Hamilton because you like him a little bit more because Jefferson was so blessed and gifted as an individual, and he was pretty much everything that Alexander Hamilton wanted to be.
I don't know about that, but
We don't shy away from tough questions here, Steve.
so, well, Jefferson and slavery. I mean, the early Jefferson, I think, is an admirable person. The later Jefferson is starting to see things like the Missouri Compromise and other efforts to try to perhaps contain the expansion of slavery. He is literally describing that as a Federalist plot. In other words, these are the heirs. The Federalists are dead as a party, but these are the heirs to the Federalist Party who are trying to restrict the expansion of slavery. So unfortunately, I wish this wasn't the case, because I admire the early Jefferson. I admire the author of the Declaration of Independence. I admire the early Jefferson, who was much more willing to challenge the issue of slavery. The older Jefferson is not, and in fact, as I said, he hardens his position on slavery as time goes on. He even rejects a proposal that somebody makes to him to pay for the release of his slaves and to secure his legacy. He rejects it. So, and as far as the Jefferson Memorial and FDR, Thomas Jefferson is just, in American historiography, is not, outside of the South, is not a national hero on par with Washington or Lincoln. It's really FDR who puts Jefferson on the nickel, who puts Jefferson on the most commonly used postage stamp, who erects that beautiful memorial, and who engages in a 12-year campaign to elevate Jefferson. FDR is on the board of directors of the Monticello Foundation. And he's the one who elevates Jefferson and puts him into this holy trinity of Washington, Lincoln, and Jefferson on the mall here. But on the in some ways more important question about Jefferson and slavery, I wish I could agree with you, but I don't think that's accurate. I think the older Thomas Jefferson reveals unfortunately, an ugly side.
Okay, we got back here on the.
Well, gentlemen, Tom Carrico, wonderful kind of review of some historical elements of this. I wanted to invite you to kind of bring it up and get some hard conclusions or applications, rather, for today. And I want to do so by way of a document that Hamilton had quite an imprint on, and that's Washington's farewell address. I don't think it was mentioned much, but two elements of that come to mind. First of all, the conjuring that Hamilton helps Washington say to beware of the insidious wiles of foreign influence. And the second one is, above all, the theme of union above all else. I'm taken by the fact that just a couple months ago, a website by the name of The Federalist published an article kind of calling for the divorce of red states and blue states. It's kind of an odd impulse. And I wonder what Hamilton might think about all this today.
Union, that was Hamilton's, as Steve mentioned, like Lincoln, his primary goal, and for a host of reasons, disunion would be the precursor to a kind of nightmare in North America. I'd leave it at that.
I'm just trying, I'm conjuring up the lines from the farewell address, which, for those of you who don't know, Washington is obviously the president. He's in Philadelphia. Hamilton is up in New York. He's left the government. He's practicing law. But throughout Washington's second term, Hamilton is still serving as Washington's closest advisor, even though he's a private citizen. And drafts of this farewell address are going back and forth between Washington and Philadelphia and Hamilton and New York. And Washington keeps a very tight control, editorial control over this farewell address. But it definitely is a co-authored piece. Both of them, I think, just to sort of address your larger point, Tom, both of them, I think, were fearful of the long-term prospects for keeping this union together, which was part of the reason why you do see these, this sort of pushing back against foreign influence, foreign wiles inside the United States. Both were deeply concerned about that, and they had good reason to. I mean, the French ambassador to the United States in 1796 endorsed Thomas Jefferson for president. That's a kind of interference in well, until recently. Ambassadors are supposed to stay out of that kind of stuff. They had good reason to fear French influence at the time. It was France that was the problem in the United States, and tried constantly to convince their fellow Americans, both in the farewell address but elsewhere, as I said earlier, to think continentally, to put the parochial, put the fact that they were born in Virginia, they should be able to rise above that, as Washington had, and the fact that they might consider themselves Democrat Republicans, they should ultimately be able to rise above that and think of themselves as Americans. So it was all about union, and it was all about convincing the American people to think continentally.
Okay, I'm going to move across the room here. We're right in the front. Mike is coming.
Good morning. My name is Meredith Singer. I was wondering if you might be able to address Hamilton's views on women and the rights of women. It wasn't really a theme that came out so much in the musical either. I also just saw it on Broadway 2 weeks ago. But given that he had so many strong women in his life, I was just wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about what his real views were.
Not enlightened, I would say. The one thing the musical does is inject that theme into the musical, and but in terms of how things happened, there's a certain element of truth to it. The Declaration, as a kind of precursor to the Seneca Falls Declaration, but Hamilton's views on women. This is somewhat in contrast to Burr's, actually, were very traditional. He made fun, he criticized the French reforms of divorce law in the 1790s and was promptly ridiculed by Democratic Republicans. Mr. Hamilton, the adulterer, is defending the traditional family, so to speak. Very traditional, I think. One thing about Chernow's biography, though, and this was an important correction, was that he fleshed out the character of Betsy Schuyler in a way that no one has done before, and she must have been a very interesting person. She was always slighted in the historical record as being, second rate in comparison to her sister, Angelica. But there are reasons to doubt that.
I don't have a heck of a lot to add except to say something about Eliza. She, of course, lives in Washington. She dies in Washington, D.C. in 1854. So she outlives her husband by 50 years. She dies at the age of 97, which was unheard of back then. And she spends a good part of that, so she's a widow from 1804 for 50 years. She spends a good part of that time trying to protect or perhaps get the word out about her husband's legacy. So whatever happened in that horrific extramarital affair, she obviously was willing to put that aside somehow. And God bless her for the work that she did to try to keep her husband's legacy alive.
Okay, let me go back there.
My name is Jan Lilja, and I would be very interested in hearing some commentary from the two of you about the rivalry between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, which we haven't touched upon yet. It's portrayed in the musical as something that starts at a very young age, both on a professional and personal basis, and I'd appreciate hearing what you think about that portrayal.
So they were both Revolutionary War veterans. They're both powers, in a sense, in Manhattan. They both practiced law. They argued cases with each on the same side. They argued against each other frequently. They knew each other quite well. But I think, though, there were two fairly large egos there, and Manhattan at the time was a pretty small place. And the first note of friction that I'm aware of is when Burr helps to defeat Hamilton's father-in-law for a New York Senate race in the early 1790s. And then there's a whole series of arguably retaliatory measures on Hamilton's part directed against Burr, blocking him or helping to block him in 1800 in the disputed election with Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton urges Federalists to vote for Jefferson over Burr. Burr's aware of this. 1804, Hamilton helps to defeat Burr in his race for governor of New York. So there's just a series of these flashpoints. Now, supposedly, at the very end in Albany, Hamilton utters some reprehensible comment about Aaron Burr that is too horrible to repeat. There's a lot of speculation as to what that might have been. That leads to the challenge of the duel, which Hamilton probably could have gotten out of at any number of points, but he was, I think, kind of prickly when it came to these sorts of things. So that's a very quick overview of two large egos working in the same area with great ambitions.
Okay, why don't we go here to the end?
Many of us are surprised by the language used today in the political arena, most recently the description of Mr. Trudeau. I was curious back then, did they use language like that in public? Was everything very politely said? Was all this stuff appearing in the press, you know, when you had, like you said, you had your own press agents who would cast aspersion? But how was the language? Was it gentlemanly? Or was it the opposite of gentlemanly, which I don't know what the opposite is, but how was it?
There was a lot of impolite language at the time, and politics was, you know, as vicious as it is today, I think. There are a couple of differences, though, and two I'd point to. One, a figure like Jefferson or Hamilton would not say impolite things in their own name. They would have a surrogate do it. Jefferson especially was good at this. The other thing is, and so we shouldn't, you know, get our hopes up about the character of political speech. But the other thing I'd say, though, is that one contrast to today, and this is, you know, serious concern. At the time of the founding, there were lows, but there were also peaks, and the peaks are getting a lot fewer, and the lows are just as low as they've ever been. That's a worry.
Just to quickly add, I mean, again, as Peter said, most of the scurrilous comments made in public were done by surrogates. But if you go through some of the private correspondence of these folks, you do find some real gems. One of my favorites is when Jefferson finds out that Hamilton had been hit in the head with a rock at a rally to promote the Jay Treaty, which was a very controversial measure. Jefferson can barely contain his delight that Hamilton had been chased off this little rostrum somewhere in a park in New York City. And I think he makes some joke about the brains of the Federalist Party, you know, being knocked out. Rough stuff.
Okay, we have one last question. We're going to go there in the back. Yeah, we got a microphone behind you.
Arlene. That was my question, is the relationship between Hamilton and John Jay. John Jay went overseas and negotiated the Treaty of Paris, and then he came back and he became, I think, governor of New York. And they were both interested in the anti-slavery movement. I know John Jay was instrumental in developing the first anti-slavery law in New York. Could you explain the relationship and also of John Jay's diplomatic, in the Federalist Papers, it seems that John Jay was more concentrated on diplomatic perspectives and then the New Republic?
Their relationship went back a long way to the days of the Revolution, and somehow in Hamilton's networking, he got connected with John Jay. So they had a long relationship. To cut to the kind of chase, the Jay Treaty, which Jay negotiated with Great Britain, Hamilton thought was a bad deal, as we'd say today. But it was better than no deal, and he vigorously defended it. And it turned out to be a pretty good deal in the end, and paved the way for some other good deals.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that in terms of the Jay Treaty, which I think most diplomatic historians looking back would agree that it was probably the best we could get at the time. But Washington had considered for a time sending Hamilton on that mission to Britain. And thank God that didn't happen, because it would have now maybe he would have gotten a better deal, but it would have cemented this notion that Hamilton was a British agent, which was gospel amongst the Jeffersonians.
Well, unfortunately, we are coming to an end. I have a few people to thank. Again, I want to thank Seth Kaller and the Gilder Lehrman Institute. So there's still documents outside of Hamilton. You can enjoy looking at them. I'd like to thank Peter McNamara and Steve Knott. And I'd like to thank Alexander Hamilton, who both of them have been very kind to illuminate his thoughts today. So thank you for coming. We are done.
Good questions.